think the obvious starting point for discussing The Look of Silence is to start with The Act of Killing, the film you made before this. They're dramatically different in terms of the ways that they're made, stylistically, in terms of the people they focus on, and yet obviously there's a kinship there. So we should talk a little bit about how this piece emerged out of that one and what the relationship really was like there.
Well, the first, there's a scene in The Look of Silence which really inspired the making of both films, and it's the scene where the two men take me down to the river, taking turns playing victim and perpetrator, showing how they pretending to be proud. And I would emphasize pretending to be proud of what they did as they take me to the spot where they helped the army kill 10,500 people. And then reveal that one of them killed my friend's son and brother, Romley. And that was that I shot that scene in January 2004. And it was the first time had been shooting already with the perpetrators for 8 months at the request of Adi, his family, and the other survivors who had been threatened by the army back in 2003 not to participate in the film. They then called me to this secret nighttime midnight meeting and said, "Don't give up, try to film the perpetrators." I was afraid to do so at first, but when I overcame that fear and approached them, I encountered this horrific boasting. And I spent the first 8 months filming them one-on-one because I didn't know if it would be safe to bring two together. One might tell the other, "You shouldn't talk about this," and we could get in trouble. And the whole thing could stop before we even really understood what had happened, where it happened, how it happened. But after around 8 months, I felt I need to see if these men are only boasting for me when I'm alone with them, or it's something about me and my camera, or would they talk this way with each other? And I took the risk of bringing two men together and to film that scene, and I saw that they were even worse when they were together, that somehow they were clearly reading from a shared script, and the boasting, therefore, I had to acknowledge, is systemic, is political, is a symptom of impunity. And I had to relinquish whatever hope I might have, comforting hope that these men are psychotic or monsters. Whatever psychosis or monstrosity is evidenced here is political as well and collective. And that realization came to me actually through the thought, which I had for the first time when I was walking down to the river with those two men, that it's as though I've wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust only to find the Nazis still in power. If the rest of the world had celebrated the Holocaust while it was taking place. And I decided, I had this awful sense that that this may not be some surreal scenario from science fiction. This may not be this weird exception to the rule. This idea of what if the Nazis had won. It actually there have been numerous massacres across the global south where there's been no justice, where impunity prevails, and people live in fear. And I started to wonder whether perhaps this impunity is the story of our times, whether perhaps the idea of what if the Nazis had won is not the exception, but the rule across much of the world. And I decided that evening I would stop everything else I was doing, all my other projects, and focus on this impunity, not on what happened in 1965 for as long as necessary. And I knew that very evening, I noted in my diary, I'll make 2 films. One about the lies, the fantasies, the stories the perpetrators tell themselves so they can live with themselves, and the terrible effects of those lies when imposed on the whole society. And that, of course, is The Act of Killing, and it's a film about escapism and guilt. And so it is a kind of flamboyant fever dream of a film. And I knew I would make a second film, though, which is asking what is it like, especially for the survivors, but for any human being, to have to live in that regime of corruption, thuggery, fear that the perpetrators have built. What does it do to human beings to have to live for half a century in silence and in fear? And The Act of Killing, there's an uncut, a longer, sort of the original uncut version of the film is out in the US as the director's cut. But it's the version that was released outside the US. I only mention it because it's cut through by these moments of absolute silence and sort of moments where time stops. And it's these moments where the perspective shifts from the perpetrators to the absent dead, I think. And in The Look of Silence, I had this feeling that the audience should feel as though they've entered any one of those haunted silences that punctuate the act of killing, and feel what would it be like to have to live there, to have to, as a survivor, rebuild a life in the rubble, surrounded by the still powerful men who killed your loved ones. What is it like never to be able to grieve openly, and therefore never to be able to mourn and heal? And what is it like to, what does that do to a family, to a human being, to our capacity to love? That's The Look of Silence.
It's a really powerful way of talking about the symbiotic relationships with the two films, because they both involve two very different kinds of risk. In the first film, I think a lot of people came out of it wondering why you wouldn't confront these people about these atrocities they were boasting about, and that's the essence of this movie, which makes one wonder, what were the conditions under which that could happen, and how did you manage with Adi to go about making that happen?
Well, so as I said, Adi was the person who I started this journey with in 2003, and while I was filming The Perpetrators, he would watch everything I had time to show him. And we shot The Look of Silence after editing The Act of Killing, but before it had its first screenings, at which point I knew I couldn't safely return to Indonesia. A couple years before, though, when we finished shooting, The Act of Killing, I'd given Adi a small camera to use as a kind of visual notebook to look for images that might inspire the making of the second film. And when I came back, and while I was editing The Act of Killing, Adi was sending me tapes. When I returned to Indonesia after we finished the editing in 2012 to make The Look of Silence, I didn't know Adi would be the main character. I just knew he would be a main collaborator still. And I sat down with him and said, "What do you think we should do for the second film?" And Adi said, "I've spent 7 years watching the footage you've shot with The Perpetrators. It's changed me. And I need to meet them. I need to go and confront the men who killed my brother." And I said instantly, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. There has never been a nonfiction film where survivors confront perpetrators who are still in power. It's simply too dangerous. And Adi took out the camera, said, "Let me explain why this matters to me," and took out the camera that I'd given him and took out a tape. And he said, "I'm sorry, but I never sent you this tape because it's very personal to me." And he put it in the trembling. He put the tape in the camera, pressed play, and as soon as the image appeared on the footage appeared that he shot on the flip screen of the camera, before I could even really see what it was, he started to cry. And he proceeded to show me the one scene in The Look of Silence that Adi shot. And it's the scene where his father at the end is crawling through the house, lost, calling for help. And he said, "Joshua, this was the first day my father couldn't remember me, my brothers, my sisters, my mother. And he was calling for help, lost, confused all day. And when we would try to help him, we were strangers to him, and he would only grow more afraid. And it was unbearable to sit there, watch it, waiting for him to get better, not being able to do anything. And at some point, not knowing what else to do, I picked up the camera and filmed. I had it, he said, because it was a sort of family reunion. And while filming, he said the moment I started to film, I understood why I was filming. I was filming because this is the day that it becomes too late for my father to heal. He's forgotten the son whose murder destroyed his life, destroyed our family's life, but he hasn't forgotten the fear. And now he will never be able to work through that fear and heal because he can't remember what happened. And so I feel like, he said, my father's is now trapped in this prison of fear, like a man locked in a room who can't remember even where the door is, let alone where he's put the key. And then we watched the scene in silence as it finished, and at the end he looked at me and said, Joshua, I do not want my children to inherit this prison of fear from my father, my mother, and from me. And I think if I visit the perpetrators, they'll see that I'm not there for revenge, I'm not there out of anger, and they'll greet this as an opportunity to make peace with their neighbors, to find forgiveness from one of their victims' relatives, and they will acknowledge what they did was wrong, and I'll forgive them, and in that way, finally, we will be able to live with our neighbors no longer afraid, but as human beings.